Here we are,
All right, packed house.
packed house, and we get to do our bad Twitter jokes on stage now.
Yeah.
It's good. So the idea for this panel started because you are one of those people who I love following on Twitter because you call out stuff that I also would like to call out.
Yeah.
So thank
So
you.
for those who, I'll just back it up
Yeah,
and
yeah,
do
yeah,
the
yeah.
introduction. So for those who don't know, my name is Niraj Agarwal. I'm the director of communications for Coin Center, cryptocurrency policy think tank. You've probably seen some of our work surrounding like the Tornado Cash sanction, things like that. We're suing the government in two separate lawsuits, one related to financial surveillance and the other related to the Tornado Cash sanction. So because of that role, I often find myself being the liaison between crypto and the mainstream world, particularly journalists and policymakers. And that positioning makes me a little more aware of the times when crypto looks ridiculous to the outside world. And I think this cycle I finally got fed up and started tweeting about it, and that's why Austin invited me here.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, this is like, yes, obviously the real part of your job, the real work you do is
Yes, that is
incredibly
real work.
important to actually helping move this industry forwards. But, you know, I think one of the pieces that like we've been talking about for a while just in DMs is the disparity between what's often talked about as coming soon. This is also why all the 10-minute talks at Breakpoint are called soon. It's just a joke on what we see in the industry. And what actually gets shipped, right? Like that horse meme is real.
Yeah, we far too often we find entrepreneurs in the space talking about what they will do, what their thing will be used for, how it'll be great once they finally decentralize or once they finally hit the flywheel. Meanwhile, they're taking retail money now. They're putting, investor funds at risk now, and that's the type of thing that's really hard to reconcile for policymakers and media, people who look out for the sort of retail user.
Yeah, and you know the funny thing is this is not like a crypto problem. A lot of tech does this. A lot of other companies do this, right? Like if you roll it all the way back, like when the car company rolls that ad that's like look at this beautiful house, look at this beautiful spouse, like look at this road you'll drive on. Like there's selling you the hype of an idea of like if I buy this Lincoln, I will just suddenly turn into this person. And that is disingenuous, but that's marketing. And tech companies for a long time have said like, oh, we're going to change the world through short form messaging systems to connect people, right? This is like that perfect opening to Silicon Valley, the TV show. But suddenly you add tokens to this, you add real financial consequences, and it becomes a problem as opposed to just something that we all sort of know is a little disingenuous.
Yeah, I think that because crypto networks are being bought, like the tokens that power these networks are being bought by retail, it really changes the dynamic. Like if you're promising, say, that Twitter will be the public square and it ends up being a more toxic place, or Facebook is going to be the place where everyone networks, and it ends up helping the junta or whatever in Myanmar, it's a little different because there's a company that sort of can be held responsible, and the damage, though it happens locally, it's a little bit less about like a promise of future revenue or whatever. Like you sell this sort of dream of you buy this token, you're going to get rich because the network will become more useful, and then nothing ever materializes. The founder gets rich, and they have no incentive to actually make the thing work.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because like this same dynamic, this is what like private capital in the 80s and 90s was. Like private equity, like there was that whole famous case of like Bain Capital went in and they bought like the yellow pages of Italy, and in 14 months they flipped it from like being $100 million business to being something that was worth like $1.2 billion. They sold and then the whole thing crashed, right? And that sort of financial harm is not new to crypto, right? That is something that exists in the larger financial industry. But there are these sort of ideas that there's protections in place, whether that's real protection or whether it's just obfuscation. I think there's a real debate on. But like when you're taking the money of retail users, there's sort of a different level of responsibility that's applied to that. And I think there's also a conversation to be had about like why is the potential of a tech promise that doesn't ship in a token considered more serious than like, oh, participating in a genocide, right? Like your technology platform being a part of that, that's a really important, I think, separate conversation just to talk about. But when we're looking at this stuff from the perspective of crypto, it's like we would like this industry to be more transparent and better than the things it's trying to replace.
Yeah, it's become very easy to attack crypto from the mainstream perspective because there's been a lot of bad behavior. There's been a lot of obfuscation. There's the decentralized and name-only meme really holds a lot of weight. There's plenty of apps that are claiming to be decentralized, but in reality, they have a roadmap where they intend to decentralize. And so they do have a lot of power over how the tokenomics of the particular project that perhaps the retail user is not necessarily aware of. So that type of lack of transparency then, when it eventually breaks, which seems to be happening a lot more when the market goes down, becomes a huge liability, not only for that project, of course, but also just the space in general becomes hard to point to say that this is worth protecting and that it's worth having this flourish in America.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to dig into that a little more. So in some of your conversations and Coin Center's conversations with regulators, politicians, just people who are not in the space, like, does this come up often?
Yeah, one thing that lately has come up quite a bit, and I've gotten some heat for this, I guess, is that we all know that NFTs can be a lot more useful than just a JPEG, and people are doing really interesting things with ticketing, naming, all that type of stuff. But for the mainstream person, what they see is a Bored Ape, right? And that is all that an NFT can be. So it's kind of a failure of the crypto industry that the incentives that we've created have made it so that every city is currently blanketed with like pictures of ducks or whatever that are essentially like they're silly to the outside person, and the more substantial uses never get any airtime.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I have always enjoyed your fast food tweets.
Yeah, I think the Bored Ape restaurant is pretty silly.
Yes. At the same time, there is this like this is the dichotomy of this industry, right? In some level, like the hype is incredibly silly, and at the same time, it's like one of the great things is like Web3 still feels like one of the only places where you have a shot at like actually changing the world because it's not entrenched, doesn't have these frameworks that you already have to ascribe to.
Yeah, I'm curious. So you, as a comms person who's more on, like, I'm on the defense side, which is why I'm so jaded and angry. But you are more on the promotional side. So how do you think about this? How do you bridge that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things is like the planning for Breakpoint this year is very different, right? And this is not because, well, Solana is quite different than it was a year ago, but the tenor of the market, right? The point of Breakpoint last year was let's get a bunch of people together for a network that was built during COVID, and let's kind of just see what happens, right? So there was a lot of big announcements there. There were a lot of projects migrating to the network. There were a lot of like big name funds and VCs coming in, and that was a really important thing to show that the Solana ecosystem was showing up just as serious and with just as much commitment as the Ethereum ecosystem, quite frankly. And you look today at what Breakpoint is this year, and it's really focused on what are the practical things that developers need to think about and people running projects need to think about to support the next year of building. And that's a really different idea, right? We had going through all the programming, there was like, is this a project that's actually shipping something? Or is this a project that's making an announcement on a big stage and it's going to take them 6 months to actually get something out? And so there was like, the thing I try and do is to keep the Foundation's channels as intellectually honest as possible, while also not stifling the idea that we want to talk about new innovations. And I'm curious like if this worked, but like in Toli and I's kind of talk around the state of the network, we tried to make a really big distinction between these are the problems that engineers are currently working on and there are currently teams literally committing code for, versus these are problems that like there's a lot of PRDs on, right? There's a lot of GitHub proposals, there's a lot of thoughts around them, but no one's really putting any serious code into a program now that's going to ship multiple concurrent block production. That's not like on the 12-month roadmap. That's like a very important idea to get to, but it's a long process to get there. But
So
everything gets squashed.
yeah, so when you're talking to, let's say, a skeptical journalist,
Yeah.
uh, how do you
I
how
see
do you
one right there.
prioritize what you talk about? Like, how, how do you
Yeah.
differentiate?
So one of the nice things about the bear market is that I think journalists are paying more attention. And some of them are just more negative, and like that sucks. But like, you know, a lot of them are more seriously asking questions around like, okay, but what does this actually mean? How is this going to improve something for users? How is this going to fulfill its promise of changing the world? And I think when I'm talking to journalists or when I'm talking to people about talking to journalists, right? The biggest thing that I tell folks is just like, be honest. Say where your product actually is in development. Say where the code actually is. Say where the network actually is. Because the irony of having networks that are completely public is that someone's always going to find your dirty laundry. And it might take 6 months for Danny to find your dirty laundry, but he's probably going to.
I haven't been the victim of a Danny expose yet. I often find myself in a similar position, and what I have to end up doing is try to make the case that all of the bad behavior and all the retail losses and all of this harm that has happened was ultimately worth it in the service of creating this better system.
Yeah, but like part of me hates that argument because I'm totally with you on that. Like implicitly, I have made the decision that the hacks on DeFi are terrible, but they're not worth shutting down DeFi for, right? And there are real people who have real harm. Like, I've talked to folks who have lost very sizable amounts of money. That was not like it's one thing if like someone who's got $20 million loses $500,000 in a hack. That sucks, but like they're still very good. It's very different when someone loses $50,000 who like that was 60% of the money that they had. And so I don't tell people like, oh, go use DeFi, right? But the challenge is like all of these Web2 social media engines, that radicalization process that we've talked about in politics and ideas and stuff like that tracks you into crypto, right? You Google a video and you land on a YouTube video that's like, how does blockchain work? And then a few minutes later, it's like, buy Gauntlet, right? And that is a cycle that is not great in Web2, but it's really harmful when you start bringing finance into it.
Yeah, that actually the distinction in audiences I think is really important. So
Yeah.
the professional trader, if you're building really complex DeFi tooling, and you're targeting a professional trader who knows the stakes, who kind of agrees to the rules of the game before they enter this more dangerous space. That's one thing, but if once you start seeing sports ads and things that are more blatantly targeted at retail, you need to recognize that seeking out those retail customers and thus exposing them to that risk is going to invite a much higher level of scrutiny upon you.
Yeah. At the same time, like, I think something I experience and something I've seen a lot of other folks when I talk to them about this experience is the sort of hypocrisy of structure that we have where DeFi is seen as incredibly risky and scary, and yet we have I live in New York, we have a state lottery. Like, how is the government allowed to run a lottery, but like we have like we think that the idea that like, oh, DeFi is like something that needs to be stomped out. That's one of those things for me that's always felt like we have, and I think that there's a lot of folks in crypto who have this sense of like all or nothing. And I try and not go with absolutes, but there is something about that if I was in your position and I was meeting with folks like regulators and politicians all the time, it would be hard to not call out some of that stuff. Do you kind of ever have that in your head?
Not, I mean, I don't think I could make that exact argument to
Yeah.
a policymaker, but the thing is that we just have established as a society that there are some rules governing complex trading and financial instruments. I don't think they're all fair. An example would be the accredited investor standard. I think it's kind of it's very it's pulling the ladder up, I guess, for people. And it's quite easy to just, if you're not a wealthy person, to learn about cryptocurrency from all the open materials out there and participate fully. Uh, but the regulations do come from generally, like, they're not, their purpose isn't to stifle innovation. It may be a side effect for some people. The purpose is consumer protection and making sure that everyone's playing on a level playing field. So there are ways that we can achieve the goals of regulation in a different way because of the nature of DeFi, for example. Things are more transparent, stuff like that. So because of that, we try to help regulators achieve their ends while still allowing uh, cryptocurrency networks and DeFi to flourish. So
Yeah,
that's a big goal.
which is really important, right? I mean, like there are very important pieces of regulation. Like FDIC is a very basic piece of like that's a piece of government regulation, and the limits on APYs you can charge for credit cards. Like these are things that are actually very important to protecting consumers and users.
Yeah, but to the point about the purpose of this panel, it's really hard to, speaking of APY, to
Yeah.
point to like a 5,000% liquidity mining thing and say this is the same as lending like a credit card or something. That's the type of hype and bad behavior that makes our lives a lot harder in DC.
Yeah, I could very much understand that. Um, so I would love to chat a little bit about the idea that like concepts come into crypto, then they seem to just like leave a few months later. And like I'm really curious where you think that sort of hype steering comes from. Like there's like token curated registries where like
Yeah.
a whole hype cycle for 6 months back in like 2018.
So it seems like somebody creates a new thing, a new way of, let's say if someone creates the ability to create ERC20 tokens really easily or NFTs really easily, and someone else maybe figures out, oh, I can raise money by doing this, and it just immediately it triggers a gold rush of copycats. And the hype gets way out of control. Sometimes it'll trigger a whole bull run for the entire market. I think that's probably what happened with ICOs, for example. And very quickly, the market falls out because it's not based really on anything. It's kind of running amok. Now, of course, people will that's sort of the NFT bubble. The initial one seems to have tapered off. Now people can step back and use some of the tools that were built in that moment to maybe do more substantial things. But it's gonna be a while before you hear about kind of NFT hype again, I think, in the mainstream.
Yeah. So for folks who are trying to not play into that hype cycle, but obviously still want to tell people about what they're building, like what advice do you give on modulating between telling a real story about a vision you have for a product you're building and not falling into that hype trap?
I think a lot of what people are doing still in crypto is addressing and decentralizing very complex financial transactions that the layperson already has no understanding of how they work in the traditional sense. So I think we could all do a better job of explaining even as simple as how a direct person-to-person crypto transaction differs from like a credit card transaction. That there's five or six intermediaries that are being cut out right there. So that side-by-side comparison and really explaining why it's worth the cost of having this global network of validators to do it, like what the advantage is from a really base level. Like you should have that documentation really ready to go at a moment's notice. Why is this better?
Yeah. Yeah, sort of a contentious topic to talk about Twitter being full of bots. But something that I have noticed just in my own interactions is like there's something about the Web3 ecosystem that kind of galvanizes anti-information. It's not even misinformation. It seems like there's a lot of churn from people who may hold bags in a specific token to make lots of statements that they're not even false information. They just seem like they're trying to throw everything at at the wall and see if anything sticks.
Yeah, at some point, everyone naturally gathered around this information warfare method of Twitter engagement, where and it is all based on who's got what bag. So we kind of accidentally created a decentralized boiler room where people, and this is part of the reason that so many people hate cryptocurrencies, because the fans are pretty irritating when it comes to promoting their own bags, and so
Yeah.
for a long time it was quite bad before Twitter really clamped down on the spam stuff, and even though it's picked back up of late, I guess Elon's gonna fix it or whatever. But the it, it's like pretty unskilled, just like slamming people with 100 blank token comments
Yeah.
I won't name.
Like liking Solana is not a personality trait.
Yeah, and people really do that. People love, they do that, and they take it really personally, and they will jump into people's mentions. They'll accuse people of being shills. It ultimately hurts their cause, I think.
Yeah. I'm sure you've been accused of shorting.
Yeah, everyone thinks that we secretly lobby for every other coin that's not theirs.
I mean, in a past life, for a little while I worked in journalism, and I think one of the things that's fair to say is if everyone thinks you're working for the other guy, you're probably doing the right thing.
Yeah, we really pride ourselves on our tech neutrality.
Yeah. So, what are some of the things like that you are excited about that you don't think are hype?
So I think the naming. So maybe I'm biased. I come from the domain name world way back, like 10 years ago now, where I worked for VeriSign, which runs all of .com and .net. There's one company that does that. So the fact that even back then there was a thing called Namecoin, which later became Stacks, and I'm sure there's a version on every chain now, where the idea of decentralizing this core infrastructure that is used by the U.S. government as one of its choke points on the internet is very interesting to me. So
Yeah.
so stuff like that. It's a little more boring. Like no, not there's no liquidity
No,
mining or anything like that. I would like to see more protocols ossify, burn their admin keys, that type of stuff, and therefore become part of the internet. The way that Tornado Cash is, right? It's not. Oh, even though there is a Tornado Cash DAO, it actually doesn't have any control over the contract that was sanctioned, which is what our lawsuit's about, the fact that nobody owns it. So like more of that, less control basically, and more kind of true DeFi.
yeah, I mean, you're not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Is that idea though that no one runs the thing anymore? Is that like so? One of like the kind of strange analogies here is like EPA Superfund sites, right? Where it's like there were a bunch of corporations that did this thing where they basically said like, oh, we're gonna sell our most toxic assets to another company, and then that company is gonna go bankrupt, and somehow we're gonna divest ourselves of like a $1 billion like environmental damage problem. Is that sort of like? Do you think like? I'm curious if that feels like an apt
Yeah,
analogy.
so there was an article that came out that was critical of Tornado Cast that called it a golem, the clay monster from
Yeah.
Jewish mythology. That's a better. They should have used that.
Yeah.
But we actually wrote a counter, which is that it's not a golem. It's not an autonomous, machine that can just rampage and fund terrorists or whatever. But it's more like a vending machine. Like somebody has to use it and get their private currency back out. So. I don't think that the analogy of something that's sort of just inherently toxic fits,
Yeah.
because there are valid reasons to use it.
Oh yeah, tons of
Yeah,
valid
so
reasons.
I could see why somebody who thinks there are no valid reasons for privacy or decentralized exchange or something like that could think of it like that, but they're wrong.
Yeah, that's good. I do agree with you there. Yeah, it feels like it's one of those things where new technologies are held to a higher standard than existing technologies, and like cash is an existing technology.
Yeah, there's the old joke that if cash was invented today, it would be banned.
Yeah, I think the same. You could apply the same thing to gold or
Yeah.
any like diamonds.
Yeah, ultimately that's the kind of the first principle that we use for when we're defending the peer-to-peer cash. Like we want to be as regulated as cash. So it makes total sense for an intermediary like Coinbase to have obligations for financial surveillance. I don't think that's a good idea in general, but given the laws that we have today, yes. But if I use a decentralized exchange to make an exchange with you, that's a peer-to-peer transaction, and it's too intrusive for any surveillance or registration or anything like that to happen at that level.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair statement there. Before we wrap up, what else are you thinking about in this space around? I would say like hype adjacent, right? What is sort of a practice you see in the space that feels to you like it has a similar type of problem to hype?
I think, I mean, I'm going to, as soon as the NFT people find this, they're going to yell at me on YouTube, because thankfully none are in the audience, apparently. Uh, that I think that the NFT space is really getting ahead of itself with hype, and it's particularly targeted towards retail users, perhaps because NFTs just being, pictures are much more accessible to the retail mind, and um, I hope that they are a little more responsible with their marketing.
Got it. Well, thank you for joining us here.
Yeah,
This was
thank
really
you for
fun.
having me.